Afternoon and welcome to this discussion on understanding and managing great power competition with China. If there's one aspect of US foreign policy that Democrats and Republicans seem to agree on, it's that our approach to deepening economic engagement with China has not prompted Beijing to become a more responsible stakeholder in the US-led international order. But opinion starts to diverge when we diagnose why this approach has failed and what the United States ought to do to deal with competition with China. So to address these questions, we have with us today an outstanding set of panelists. Aaron Friedberg is a professor of politics and international affairs at Princeton University, my former colleague on Vice President Dick Cheney's staff, where he was deputy assistant for National Security Affairs. Wyne is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center and a non-resident fellow at the Modern War Institute. And Paul Heer is a distinguished fellow at the Center for the National Interest and a non-resident senior fellow at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. I'm going to ask each panelist to begin with a short set of opening remarks, and then I will open the session to questions from the audience. Let's begin with Aaron Friedberg. Aaron, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, George. And I just want to thank Paul also for inviting me. Paul asked us a set of very difficult, large questions, four in particular, and I'm going to try briefly to address each of them. First, about the drivers of US-China competition. Second, about the nature and scope of the competition. Third, the question of whether this is in some sense existential. And fourth, what approach we should take going forward to deal with these problems. First, on the issue of drivers, I would certainly not say that leadership doesn't matter or events don't matter. Certainly in this case, with the pandemic and with the distinctive characteristics of the Trump and Xi administrations, it would be foolish to rule out those factors. But I think there are deeper factors at work that are more important, and I would emphasize two. One is just the traditional dynamics of geopolitics, situations where you have a narrowing gap in power between a once dominant state and a fast rising state have historically been prone to tension, to friction, and sometimes to conflict. And a lot of what we've been seeing, I think, in the last couple of decades can be explained by that phenomenon. But I don't think that's all there is to it. There is, in addition, I believe, an ideological antipathy between China and the United States, and not only China and the United States, but the United States, or rather China and other liberal democracies as well. There are irreconcilable differences, or as the Chinese might say, contradictions between the principles on which the two systems are founded. Liberal democracies based on the idea of the sanctity of the individual and individual freedom, leading to a belief in the importance of certain rights, from which follow then a belief in the virtues of certain kinds of institutions, like rule of law, representative government, market-based economics, and so on. And then on the other hand, you have the CCP system, which is in some ways difficult to characterize. It is, in my view, no longer Marxist or Maoist in any meaningful sense, but it is clearly Leninist, by which I mean it's a system in which the party has absolute primacy, it's determined to maintain its monopoly of political power, and it has really unchecked authority over every individual and every aspect of life in Chinese society. So this is, as I think the EU said in a white paper last year, a systemic rivalry. You have this narrowing power gap and really a widening ideological or systemic gap. And that has all kinds of implications that we can perhaps talk about. Let me note two. One, a profound, and I would say on both sides, well-founded mistrust each of the other. And two, difficulty, if not impossibility, of achieving a stable and lasting settlement between those actors. Secondly, on the nature and scope of the competition, it is now both regional and global. and it is going on in all domains, so the diplomatic and military, yes, but also economic, technological, political warfare, or discursive struggle domains as well. And I would note just until quite recently, I think we in the United States, maybe in the West more generally, have been focused very heavily on some parts of this competition, and we've largely ignored others. So I would say if you looked at the resources of the US government, those devoted, the portion of those total resources devoted to the military technical competition in the Asia Pacific region is probably, I don't know what percentage of the pie, but it's a very large percentage, whereas the amounts of money and time and personnel that we've devoted to some other aspects of this have been much less. Regarding China's goals in this competition, I would say there are probably three. First, in addition to maintaining the monopoly of power of the Chinese Communist Party, to reestablish China as the preponderant power, regional power in Eastern Eurasia, to carve out some kind of system or subsystem that may extend into parts of the developing world in which China would be the center and the leader, and to establish China eventually as a global power on par with, if not ultimately superior to, the United States by all measures of capability. Third, is this an existential competition? Is it an ideological competition? The CCP leadership clearly believes that it is, and I would say it has always believed that it is engaged in an ideological competition. The current CCP leadership certainly sees liberal democratic principles and the institutions and the norms that are based on them as a profound threat to its legitimacy and hence to its survival. And as their power has grown, they've increasingly been able to push back not only against the physical manifestations of American and allied power, but against what the CCP leaders see as their dangerous ideas and their subversive ideals. They would like to see liberal democratic ideas and institutions and systems weakened and discredited, and they would like others to acknowledge, at a minimum, the moral equivalence, if not the superiority of their own system. Are they trying to spread their system in that sense? Are we engaged in an ideological competition in that way that might be similar to the Cold War? I don't think that the CCP leadership is now trying to do that in the same way as the Soviet Union did during the Cold War or as China did during the Mao era. But they do want to roll back and constrict the influence of our system. And the expansion of their presence and influence will have the effect of bolstering authoritarian regimes and of weakening democracies, especially where those are relatively new and not well established. So in that sense, whether they intend to or not, I think their actions are contributing to the spread of authoritarianism and perhaps the contraction of the sphere in which democracy dominates. Finally, on the question of approach, of course, is a huge issue. In general, I would say that we need to think about how to blunt what the CCP leaders evidently believe is the momentum that they now have. And as I argued in a recent piece in Foreign Affairs, that's going to require offensive as well as simply defensive measures. And just zeroing in on the ideological or ideational domain, I'd say we need to defend ourselves better against penetration and exploitation. We need not just to talk about, but to demonstrate the superior virtues of our system, which is a tall order. But we also need to challenge not only the performance or the behavior of the CCP system, but I would argue its legitimacy. So with that, I'll stop and yield the floor.
Thank you, Aaron. I'm going to turn the floor now to Ali Wyne.
Thank you, George. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and to be with Dr. Friedberg and Dr. Heer. It's really an extraordinary honor. So thank you for having me. I'll try to be brief and share a few thoughts sort of in three buckets. First bucket, sort of framing the China challenge. Second bucket, trying to think a little bit about deconstructing the nature of strategic competition between the United States and China. And then third, just a few general thoughts about how the United States might respond to the China challenge. So in terms of framing the challenge, I think it's fair to say that in dealing with China, the United States confronts a challenge for which there isn't any self-evident historical precedent or playbook. China is obviously an increasingly formidable, multifaceted competitor. On the other hand, the United States and China, for all of the talk about decoupling, which is occurring in certain domains and to some extents, nonetheless, the extant level of interdependence, trade, technology, finance, and so forth, between the United States and China is still quite substantive and complex, and unwinding that interdependence would be quite a challenging process. And there is the need for the United States and China to salvage some baseline of cooperation in managing significant transnational challenges that bear on both of their vital national interests. So whether it's pandemic disease, climate change, and we could go through the full roster. So China is a very formidable competitor. Despite the talk of decoupling, it is still substantially intertwined with the US economy and with the global economy. And there are a number of transnational issues on which the United States and China have shared vital national interests. And so when you triangulate those data points of those characteristics of the China challenge, what I at least see is an American mandate, which is not so much achieving a decisive victory over an unalloyed adversary, but rather developing a kind of a durable modus vivendi with a complex competitor. And I agree with a point that Dr. Friedberg made, which is that finding that stable modus vivendi, that may well prove to be an impossibility. And so there's a gap between aspiration, finding a stable modus vivendi, and whether or not that aspiration can actually be realized. But I fully agree with Dr. Friedberg that finding that stable competitive coexistence will be challenging, if not, and maybe even more than challenging. So that's sort of a few opening thoughts on the nature of the challenge coming from China. And then the nature of competition, I'll just try to break it down a little bit. There is an increasingly evident military component, undoubtedly, of competition between the United States and China. I think it still is principally regional in nature, the military dimension of competition, and that is to say, I think it's still principally confined to the Indo-Pacific. Now, the fact that the nature of military competition might be somewhat circumscribed doesn't make it any less concerning, and there are growing concerns about contingencies involving Taiwan, the South China Sea, the East China Sea. So if there were to be some military confrontation between the United States and China involving one of those contingencies that I just mentioned, what is sort of the correlation of forces? How would an armed confrontation unfold? Would the United States be able to bring to bear a certain correlation of forces in time? What are guardrails against escalation? Also thinking about the potential for nuclear weapons to bear on this question. So I do think that the military component of competition, it's intensifying. It's still, I think, principally regional, but nonetheless, there are a number of scenarios that are cause for growing concern. As Dr. Friedberg mentioned in his comments, there's undoubtedly an ideological component that's growing more salient. And I think if you look at some of the rhetoric coming from the Chinese Communist Party, all the way down from Xi Jinping, some of Xi Jinping's top officials, prominent party documents, commentaries, and so forth, you see a more explicit contestation of Western values, a more explicit touting of China's contributions to global governance, China's normative contributions. Although I think I would argue that there are increasingly sharp limits to China's kind of intrinsic ideological appeal. And I think if you look at some of the polling evidence, particularly within advanced industrial democracies, I think that China's soft power and its image have really plummeted. And I think that the more that China resurges, and the more a spotlight there is that's shone on this AI-powered surveillance state, the mass internment of Uyghurs, this program of coerced labor in Tibet, the more that light is shone on those abuses, and the more that journalists report on what's going on inside of China, I think that the more, again, particularly in advanced industrial democracies, a number of elites and also publics are starting to recoil by what they see, and they are repulsed by China's ideology. So that's a little bit on the military component, a little bit on the ideological component. What are sort of the core sources of Chinese influence? And I would name 4 of them. So the first, I think, obviously, is this economic expansion undergirded by technological innovation. So the larger your economy is, the more sort of the GDP or economic heft, it's the foundation of power. And so the larger your economy grows, particularly if it's propelled by domestic consumption and domestic innovation, the more heft you have in hard power, and also potentially in converting that hard power into softer forms of influence. So that's the first form of influence. Secondly, is just China's deepening role in global governance. And I think that part of that deepening role in global governance comes from Chinese-led initiatives. So you look at Made in China 2025, you look at the Belt and Road Initiative. Some of it also comes from just America's stepping back from certain multilateral agreements and certain international institutions. And so to the extent that the United States steps back from core multilateral agreements, international institutions, China doesn't necessarily have to engage in any particularly creative revisionism. It can essentially just fill in the void. And Professor Stacy Goddard at Wellesley College, she has a nice term for this phenomenon, this notion of embedded revisionism. So existing within the post-war order and revising it from within, rather than trying to affect the dissolution of that system from the outside. So that's the second role of China's growing influence. It's just its deepening role in global governance. A third is China's touting of its domestic model in contrast with what it portrays as a dysfunctional American model. So China, particularly, I think in the age of COVID-19, has been particularly eager to portray America as being in systemic decline. So if you look at statements coming from high-ranking CCP officials and diplomats who've become increasingly active on social media channels, they talk about racial injustice. They talk about America's handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. They talk about growing income and wealth inequality. They talk about growing political polarization, growing disinformation, echo chambers. And so they're trying to portray, and then in contrast, they say, well, look at China. China's economy is the one major economy that's now recovering from COVID-19. China seems to be getting back to business as usual, literally and figuratively. And so China wants to portray itself as being stable, whereas the United States, it wants to portray as being riven by a range of injustices, a range of fault lines, and that America is systemically in decline. And then combining those 3 sources of influence, so economic expansion undergirded by technological innovation, China's deepening role in global governance, and China's narrative contrast between its model and America's domestic dysfunctions, those 3 collectively add up to a 4th, and perhaps in some ways the most profound source of influence. And I think, again, this echoes a set of points that Dr. Friedberg made. It's narrative momentum. I think one of the messages that China is trying to convey is that China is resuming its rightful place in world history, and that it's kind of inexorably resurgent, and that America, its time in the sun is over, and that it is in systemic decline. And the more that China can entrench those kind of twin or parallel reinforcing narratives, the more it may be able to convince even those countries that have very grave apprehensions about its strategic trajectory, its military intentions, and so forth, that their interests would be better served by aligning themselves over the long run with Beijing than with Washington. So I think that reversing, and then that leads me to my 3rd category, and then I'll stop. A few thoughts about what America's response should be to these sources of Chinese influence. You have to reverse that narrative. Perceptions matter. Perceptions matter at the elite level. They shape decision-making calculuses. They shape, and then in time, those decisions go on to shape realities. I think that we have to reverse that narrative, and that means that we have to not just tout the virtues of our model, but we have to demonstrate the merits of our domestic model. We have to restore our role in global governance, and in many cases, that doesn't mean doing something unusually creative or extra. It just means resuming certain breaches that we have created by our own volition. In some cases, it just means stepping back onto the playing field. And of course, we have to be more competitive economically and technologically. And I think that if we were to take those steps, we could go a long way towards reversing this narrative that China has portrayed of China being inexorably resurgent, America being systemically in decline. And the good news is that for all the talk of relative decline in the United States, I think that the United States still has a number of formidable advantages that it can bring to bear. So it still has the global reserve currency, which COVID-19 has actually heightened the centrality of that currency. It has the world's largest economy, an unrivaled ability to project military power. It has a network of alliances and partnerships that, while under duress, nonetheless remains a formidable asset. Developments in energy make the United States much less reliant on the Middle East than it was 5 or 10 years ago, and give the United States another form of economic influence. So the United States has a number of formidable advantages that it can bring to bear in reversing this narrative. And one last point, and then I'll stop here. I think that we should ensure that our response to China, it should be an important part of U.S. foreign policy, but it shouldn't be wholly determinant. And what I mean by that is that a U.S. foreign policy strategy that says that is solely oriented around, or too oriented around, how we contest China, I think risks becoming reactionary. I think what would be more effective would be, where is it that America wants to go? What is our conception, sort of an affirmative conception of a post-pandemic international system? And where do we see selective contestation with China fitting into that broader vector? And again, the good news, I'm a congenital optimist. So the good news on this front is that however maximalist China's long-term strategic intentions may be, I think that the execution thereof and the achievement thereof are constrained by China's strategic myopia. And I think that we've seen this on pretty abundant display this year. So think about where China was sort of in the first quarter of 2020. America was seen as flailing in its response to the coronavirus pandemic. At home and abroad, China said that, look, we have now contained the first wave of the coronavirus. We're back to business. China had an extraordinary opportunity, given that disparity between its performance and America's performance, to advance the Belt and Road Initiative, to advance its diplomatic standing, to really make progress on a number of fronts. And what did it do instead? It's torpedoed a number of its relationships in the Indo-Pacific, further afield in Brussels. It's hardened attitudes in Washington. It has placed many roadblocks in the way of Huawei, which is this major telecommunications giant. It has sowed a tremendous amount of distrust with its neighbors and also further afield. So China, I think that in probing a bit too much and in getting sort of too intoxicated with its own narrative of systemic American decline, has actually ended up placing a lot of diplomatic barriers in its own way. And so I do think that China's strategic myopia and its overzealousness in pursuing certain regional interests will undercut its diplomatic appeal and will undercut the extent to which it can contest the United States over the long haul. So I'll stop there and yield the floor.
Great, thanks, Ali. Paul, you come at this as a former national intelligence officer for East Asia. You've studied the China problem for many, many decades. What are your thoughts on all this?
I don't know if I'm old enough to say many, many decades, but well, thank you, George. It's a great privilege and pleasure to be here with both Aaron and Ali, who have already both said more than enough for us to talk about. I think what I'll try to do is to be brief in order to eliminate I agree with much of what's been said, so I'll try to be brief to eliminate any redundancy, and also maybe in an effort to kind of introduce some fault lines between us. I addressed the same questions that I had assigned to Aaron and Ali, and I just kind of framed my comments around, another kind of a reformulation of them. What is the competition? What isn't the competition? What it's not? And again, what I think we should do in response to it. In terms of what it is, I think in many ways it's and I think Aaron started with this. In some ways it's a classic strategic competition between great powers for wealth and power and influence, both within East Asia and globally. And as Ali said, it's a formidable competitor. I think the competition does feature competing models for governance and economic development. I'll come back to that, the ideological component, in a minute. It also features competing views on what the rules and the structure for the international order should be and global governance. What's driving it, just to reiterate, I tend to agree with Aaron that it's very much there are very much structural and systemic drivers, I think more so than ideological. And I think it primarily, in the structural sense, reflects the consequences of really the new balance of power in the wake of the Cold War and more recently in the wake of the global financial crisis. Which has kind of predictably produced a historically new status quo that was inevitably going to fuel competition between the two sides intentions and suspicions. Now, shifting to what I think the competition isn't, and this is where we might diverge a little bit. I don't think it's necessarily, at least, an adversarial relationship or a zero-sum or a winner-take-all contest. It should not, it is not or should not be exclusive of cooperation between the two sides, which in fact I think is necessary, both for the two countries and the rest of the world. I would say, incidentally, I don't think it is not just a product of Xi Jinping's personality or his personal ambitions, because I think a lot of the strategic historical drivers of the competition have predated his tenure. And to get into the thick of it, I think perhaps most importantly, I think it is not an existential ideological struggle, certainly like the one we had with the Soviet Union. And I noticed in Aaron's comments, I'm not sure whether we're equating existential with ideological. I think it is ideological, but I don't think it's existential. Because in my view, the two sides' ideologies and strategic objectives are not mutually exclusive, at least they need not be. I think China is not trying to, as is commonly said by many, trying to destroy the US system or to supplant us as the global hegemon. And this may be a minority view, but I think China has probably calculated that global hegemony is not achievable, that it's not really necessary to ensure their security and their interest, and in fact that it's not necessarily something to be wished for. I think the Chinese recognize that pursuing global hegemony would be counterproductive, and that having it would be burdensome and unsustainable. So in my view, because of this cost-benefit analysis, I think the Chinese are prepared to settle for less than that, which is why they talk so much about multipolarity. And I think it's within that framework that China is seeking, and this gets to some of the points that both Ali and Aaron made. China is seeking to internationally legitimize its model of governments, not impose it on other systems. I think I agree with Aaron that he wants to score points against and weaken our model, but I don't think it's out to destroy it or to supplant it. And I think this is partly what the Chinese mean when they talk about a community of common destiny, which has many interpretations, but I think in my reading of Chinese rhetoric on this, it's about peaceful coexistence. I mean, it's kind of a relatively benign slogan, I think. It's about mutual respect, or at least tolerance for each other's governing systems, and a shared attention to global challenges. And I think when the Chinese talk about reform of global governance, it is reform that they're talking about, not replacing the system with one of their own making. It's about, in their view, updating and adjusting the international order to make it more representative and reflective of the 21st century balance of power in the world. Now, I won't dwell on the Cold War analogy here, except to say, and I think this, Aaron mentioned this, and I think Ali, I think the competition is not like the US-Soviet Cold War, because the US and China are interdependent in ways that the US and the Soviet Union never were. And in fact, this is the first time the US has faced a strategic or ideological rival that really had its act together. I think Ali made this point about there being no real precedent for a challenge of this nature. And it's also not like the Cold War because it's not characterized by the world divided into two camps. Actually, to summarize, I think that the bottom line, from my perspective, was summarized pretty well by Chinese scholar Wu Xinbo in an article that he just published in the Washington Courier last month, in which he said, China does not pose an existential threat to the United States, yet it does threaten to dilute US hegemony, share its global leadership role, and demonstrate an alternative to its development and governance model. I think that's the challenge that we're confronting. Finally, what I think we should do about it, the first point I would emphasize is that I think the right prescription requires the right diagnosis, which is why I outlined what I see as the diagnosis of the nature and scope of the challenge. And given that diagnosis, I think we need to do several things. I think first, and we're behind the curve in this, I think we need to recognize that the balance of power in the world has changed because of historical shifts and because of the impact of globalization and interdependence. And I think because of this, we need to recognize how all of this is reflected in the relative clout and capabilities of the United States and China today. This, I think, frankly, should lead us to see the need for trade-offs and reciprocity in our approach to China, and the need to better match our ambitions with our means and our ends. And in fact, summarily, to recognize that I think a policy of containment or of regime change for China are not realistic strategies and would probably be counterproductive. I think, frankly, this also means that we need to recognize that U.S. primacy, both within East Asia and globally, are becoming historical artifacts. I don't think that they're any longer viable or sustainable. And in fact, I mention that because it's important for us to recognize that U.S. allies and partners, with that in mind, are not inclined to join us in what they perceive or fear might be a zero-sum contest, or one that focuses on containment or regime change in China. So what should the elements of a recalibrated approach based on this diagnosis be? I think Ali talked about the military component of the challenge, and I agree with that. But I think one of the most important elements of the China challenge is that although it has a substantial military component, it is primarily in the economic and technological and political realms. That's the nature of the challenge we face from China. So I think among the kind of prescriptions I would outline, I think we need to revise and mobilize U.S. economic competitiveness. For example, rather than complain about the Belt and Road Initiative, I think we need to compete against it by offering alternatives to the countries that China is targeting with it. I think we also need to revive and mobilize U.S. diplomacy. We can't make progress with China if we're not willing to talk to them. And as I think Ali mentioned, there are a lot of global issues in which the United States and China do need to cooperate. I could get into the debate about engagement. All I'll say about that is that I don't think it's failed. I just think it hasn't succeeded yet, and it's going to need more time. I think we can and should, on the deterrent side of the equation and the pushback side of the equation, which I think also applies to the economic and diplomatic components of this, of course we can and should continue to maximize our deterrence in every realm: the military realm, the space realm, cyber realm, internet influence operations. Aaron talked about this. But I think we need to avoid militarizing issues which are not primarily military. And we can come back to that, but I think Taiwan fits in that category, and maybe even the South China Sea. And I think that should be the basis for our efforts to reinvigorate the alliances on the basis of a more stable foundation of shared and realistic goals. Finally, and many, many commentators have said that all of this is going to require the United States to get its act together. We need to realize, frankly, I think to a certain extent, that we are blaming China for some problems that are self-imposed by our own domestic problems. I mentioned we need to revive our economic competitiveness, and we basically need to make U.S. democracy and capitalism more internationally competitive again. And my closing thought is that really, I don't think if we can do that, we should not be afraid of this competition with China unless we've lost faith in our own model. And I haven't, because I think it is still superior, and that's where we should be headed. I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul. I think that's an excellent way to leave it. We've begun to tease out, I think, some differences in our analysis among the panelists and our prescriptions. I'm now going to move to questions to the panelists, and I'm going to exercise my moderator's prerogative and ask the first one myself. And it has to do with what China's goals are. And I heard some hints that perhaps China was aiming for what you might call primacy, some sort of Chinese-led international order. And I also heard some suggestions that their ambitions fell well short of that they were looking for a multipolar world, one in which China would have considerable influence, but not necessarily primacy. And my question to the three of you, is there a real difference of opinion among you on the degree to which China is seeking primacy? I would imagine that Chinese primacy is not something that the United States would feel comfortable with at all. This would be not something we would be willing to compromise with. If China is looking for a multipolar order, and if we all acknowledge that to some significant degree, we have already moved in that direction of multipolarity, that would suggest that perhaps this competition is not quite as zero-sum as many people assume. So where do you think China comes down in this question? Who wants to start? Aaron?
I'll defer to Aaron for now.
Well, I think we don't fully know the answer of what what are the CCP's ultimate objectives. I'm not sure they know the answer. In some respects, their rise has come on them rather quickly, and I think they're kind of scrambling to catch up still in thinking about the extent to which they would like to change the world. I think they too were focused for a long time primarily on the regional situation, and they had a pretty developed view of what they wanted there. But they've grown very rapidly. They've acquired these global interests, and now they sort of have to figure out what kind of a global role they want to play. I agree with what Paul said. My sense is that at least the current leadership is not seeking to play a role equivalent to the role that they see the United States having played over the last 40 or 50 years, in part because they see it as burdensome, wasteful. I think one part of their explanation for what they see as now our relative decline is that we wasted a lot of resources and got ourselves involved in all kinds of conflicts that didn't ultimately serve their interests. I don't think they want to do that. I also don't think they have any pretense, as maybe Mao might have, or Stalin might have, of overthrowing Western liberal democracy. I don't think they expect to see a red flag flying from the Capitol dome in Washington, and that's not what they're interested in. But I do think for them to expand their influence as they would like to, both regionally and globally, and come back to that in just a minute, they believe that it is in their interest for the United States to be separated to the extent possible from its allies, and for its allies to the extent possible to be divided against one another. So that is a part of their diplomatic strategy. I think the interesting question, and perhaps it's one that we haven't paid enough attention to until very recently, is how they are thinking about the global South, for lack of a better term. They seem to attach a lot of importance to this, and it perhaps is for a variety of reasons. Certainly there is an economic element, initially primarily an interest in resources perhaps, but I think also increasingly a view that the developing world is where growth is going to be over the next 50 years or 100 years, and that this will be a source of markets, particularly if they want to reduce their dependence on the United States and on other advanced industrial democracies. Where is the growth going to come from? It's not just going to be internal circulation. It's going to have to be external. And I think they see the developing world as a source of growth in that regard. They also, and just the final point, there's much more one could say about it, but they clearly see the global South as a potential source of support for their efforts to extend their influence, to gain legitimacy, as I think both Paul and Ali said, and also to constrain the United States and the democracies. And this is one part of the competition to which I think we are waking up very belatedly, the realization that in these multilateral institutions that we set up primarily because of the one country, one vote rule, it's possible for China, using a variety of methods, some of them nefarious, to gain support and to put people into positions of responsibility, like the head of the WHO, who are, if not beholden to them, at least very sympathetic to their point of view. And lo and behold, that constrains us and gives advantages to them. So again, that's another reason I think why they're interested in developing world. And there are other parts, ability to project military power and so on. But that's a piece of this puzzle that I think is very important and requires further study.
Other comments? Okay.
I have some comments, but I was going to defer to Ali first. If he had
I was about to defer to you and say I have some comments as well, but I can make them later.
Okay. Well, no, I agree with a lot of what Aaron said. I mean, I think that, George, you said the United States wouldn't necessarily be comfortable with China having primacy. One of my points was I don't think China would be necessarily comfortable having Chinese primacy. I think where my views kind of really overlap with Aaron's, I think clearly, and I think Ali's, clearly China is trying to maximize its influence and its wealth and power relative to that of the United States, and if necessary, at the expense of the United States. And I appreciate his comments about the global South, because from the Chinese perspective, that's the arena for a lot of that competition. That's what the Belt and Road Initiative is about. And the Chinese think that because of the one man, one vote, you know, they still pretend to be a developing country under WTO rules, I guess. And they see themselves as kind of the spokesmodel for the plurality of votes in the UN. And they use that on any number of issues. But I would agree with Aaron that the economic competition is the central thrust of that right now. In fact, I think that's where we're, as I mentioned, a little bit behind the curve. I think in terms of, you know, Aaron started by saying that we don't know yet, and probably the Chinese don't, and I think that's a valid point. Although the point that's always made in connection with that is that China's ambitions and desires will expand along with its capabilities. I think there's a limit to that. Because I'm not sure that they are, well, that limitless, because of the, I think the Chinese ability to perceive how problematic it's been and how unsustainable it could be. That's why I think, as I said, their cost-benefit analysis leads them towards pursuing something less than hegemony. Yeah, I guess that's it for now.
I'll just make some, because I think this question, you know, George, is incredibly important. I'll just make some brief comments, and hopefully we can get to other questions. On the first question, you know, what are China's objectives? I've actually been spending some time for some research that I'm working on. I've been spending some time the past few weeks, you know, looking at very authoritative assessments, scholarly assessments of Chinese objectives. And so, you know, I've read work by, you know, Oriana Schuyler Mastro, Michael Swain, Aaron Friedberg, Liza Tobin, Daniel Tobin, Nadej Roland, and it's been really fascinating to see, you know, if you look at, you know, individuals and scholars who have really probed authoritative CCP documents, statements, interpreting phrases such as community of common destiny and so forth, that there is, I think, a range of interpretations about, you know, what China's long-term strategic objectives are. And I think that, but I think that Dr. You know, Friedberg's point still obtains, which is that it might be premature to say that either external observers can discern with 100% accuracy what those intentions are, or that even China's leaders know with. And I think I think that Dr. Friedberg made a really interesting point, which is something that hadn't occurred to me, which is that I suspect the Chinese leaders themselves have probably been taken aback by how rapidly their global footing has grown just over the past 2 decades. I mean, at the turn of the century, if you were talking about sort of the global balance of power, I mean, even honestly, I would say that it wasn't until the global financial crisis that I first started, you know, hearing inklings of this narrative about sort of America and systemic decline. China is a potential near-peer competitor, but I think that China's power and influence have grown far more rapidly than its diplomatic sway, its diplomatic sort of adaptiveness. And I think that we're seeing some of the consequences of that imbalance playing out with its so-called wolf warrior diplomacy. I think that China is, you know, so I think that's sort of one point, is that there's sort of this imbalance between its economic heft, its overall power, and its diplomatic sort of savoir-faire, its diplomatic savvy. And another point that I would make is this distinction between, or I shouldn't say distinction, but I guess this juxtaposition of intentions and capabilities that Beijing could bring to bear in service of those intentions. I thought that John Culver had a really nice piece on this for a Lowy Institute forum that was published a few weeks ago. And he says that, again, there is what the CCP might aspire to do, and there's what they might actually be able to do in practice. And I do think that China, despite being a very formidable, multifaceted competitor, I think it has very real constraints. Internally, its demographic outlook is quite grim among major powers. Its state-owned, or its state-run or state-centric, you know, growth model is encountering growing inefficiencies. I think that it is contributing to its own encirclement in the Indo-Pacific on account of its conduct. I think it's inspiring growing distrust abroad. And so I think that China in many ways is laying out obstacles to its own resurgence. So however maximalist its long-term intentions might be, I think a combination of extant structural internal challenges, the inherent unpredictability of geopolitics, which complicates China's time horizons. And I think that some of China's strategic blunders, I think that combination is going to get in the way of whatever long-term intentions China might have.
Great. Well, speaking about constraints on China, Aaron, in your foreign affairs article, you spoke a little bit about some of the inherent weaknesses that China suffers from, and pointed out that several of these things are things that the United States might want to take advantage of in this competition. James Kelly has a question on this topic. He says, please comment on the effect of the now intense cult of personality of Xi. Might this weaken the party itself?
Well, I should defer to a real China expert, Paul, to answer that question. But even though I'm not one, I'll take a stab at it. There's two things. One, it is striking, at least it appears from the outside, and I guess we'll have more insight into this at in the next 2 years, the party Congress, the extent to which Xi really does put himself in a position of permanent authority, that the norms that Deng Xiaoping established after Mao's demise to try to prevent the concentration of power and the abuses that had gone with that now seem to have gone out the window. They certainly appear to have done so. And that, among other things, would seem to me to suggest that the next time there is a competition for leadership, it could well be a duel to the death, not a kind of benign process like the one that China has gone through in the last several iterations, where some selectorate of several hundred people gets together and converges on a choice. The rules have been broken, it seems to me, which isn't to say they couldn't be reestablished. And also, as people have pointed out, particularly as a result of his anti-corruption campaign, Xi has made a lot of enemies. So what looks stable may not stay stable. And some of the things that seem to support the stability of the regime appear to have been weakened by the way in which Xi has concentrated power. I guess the other point, and it's one that's commonly made, I guess I'm inclined to believe it's true, but I'm not sure, and I don't know exactly how one would get the evidence, but it's often said that in regimes in which power is so heavily concentrated at the top in the hands of one or a small handful of people, there's a tendency for those people to get cut off from reality because everyone is reluctant to challenge them and to tell them that what they're doing doesn't make sense or is counterproductive. There's certainly evidence that anyone who sticks their head up in the broader Chinese society and criticizes Xi Jinping is in for big trouble. And a number of people who had the nerve to do that have been sentenced to prison and so on. But does that mean that the regime is more prone to make mistakes? I think there is an increased risk of that. If that phenomenon is true, is accurate, if it applies in this situation, then I would worry about the ability of the regime, for example, to recognize that some of what it has done in the last year or so has in fact been counterproductive. They may not see it that way. There may be arguments to be made that perhaps it won't be counterproductive in the long run, but I doubt there's anyone sending a memo up to the boss and saying, you know, you've really kind of led us too far down this path and maybe we should rethink. I don't think that that kind of discussion is going on.
Great. I'm going to now read a question from John Negroponte, former U.S. ambassador, former director of national intelligence, who says, I am concerned by our current repeated public attacks on the Communist Party of the PRC and wonder what impact this might have on the PRC's willingness to negotiate with us. How can one attack the party and then expect its leader to wish to seek any sort of accommodation with us? There's nothing new about the Communist Party of China. They've been in charge from day one. How does our rhetoric on this subject play with the leadership in Beijing? Paul, you want to tackle that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's highly problematic. I mean, this appears to have been an emerging, well, it has been emerging as a central thread of the administration's approach to China. This notion that we can and should separate the Chinese Communist Party from the Chinese people. And some of the statements that were made by Secretary of State Pompeo and actually by Deputy National Security Advisor Matt Pottinger earlier this spring kind of mentioned this point. I think it's risky and more likely to be counterproductive because I think it plays to Chinese nationalism. As long as certainly there's a lot of resentment of the Chinese government among the Chinese people. But in the face of foreign challenges, there's a tendency to rally around the flag, if you will, on the Chinese side. And I think it promotes the kind of nationalism and potentially undermines the constituency we're trying most to cultivate. This is why I said in my remarks that I think a policy of regime change, which is what is perceived to be, is risky and likely to be counterproductive. I would agree with Ambassador Negroponte.
Aaron, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I think you had what I might call a sort of a nuanced view on this particular topic. Care to comment on this?
Yes, I think there are different ways in which one can talk about the nature of the regime, but I do think it's important to talk about it. It's important as a way of explaining to our own people the nature of the challenge that we face. It's important also as part of an effort to undermine the CCP's narrative as it tries to go abroad and expand its influence. I think we should be talking about the things that it's doing to its own people, starting with concentration camps for 1 million plus Uyghurs and so on. But also, if this is a contest of systems, I think we have to talk about the differences between a system that's based on, as I said before, the sanctity of the individual, and one that's based on the primacy of a political party. I don't think we should hesitate to do that. I'm of the view that the CCP leadership believes and always has believed that we are out to do them in. They've been concerned about peaceful evolution since Mao. Everything we know about their deliberations, to the extent that we get some insight into those, and things that they say publicly about what happens in Hong Kong or anywhere else, would suggest that they think there isn't a leaf that falls that isn't the responsibility of Paul's former employer, and part of an effort to undermine the legitimacy of the regime. So I don't think they're shocked to hear us saying out loud things that they believe that we have always believed and been trying to do. I'm also not sure about Paul's point on promoting nationalism. It's an important question, and again, it may depend on how this is done. The CCP has aligned itself with China, China's history, the Chinese people, Chinese culture. Everything about China and every Chinese person is somehow dependent on and should be grateful to the CCP. So it is difficult to criticize the CCP and its policies, or at least when you do that, you know that you're going to get that response. At the same time, to the extent to which we can make the point that if our relationship has deteriorated, if we're doing things that do impose costs on ordinary Chinese people, that is in response to aggressive actions that the CCP regime has taken. It seems to me that that is a fair and reasonable thing for us to do. Not easy necessarily, but not something we should shy away from. I think in the long run, well, we know that the CCP regime is very concerned about its popular support and legitimacy. It invests enormous resources in coercion, but also in positive attempts to bolster its standing and to deliver things for the Chinese people. This is a preoccupation of theirs that suggests a vulnerability. And when you're engaged in a strategic competition, I don't think you can afford to entirely overlook the vulnerabilities of your opponent. That doesn't mean that you should engage in reckless attacks or kind of sloppy rhetoric that compares Xi Jinping to Stalin or Mao. But it also doesn't mean that you should shy away entirely from talking about those kinds of issues. We have to find a way to do that.
Actually, if I could just add a thought, George, I mean, I agree with that. I mean, again, the nature of the regime is clearly repugnant to us, and the way that it does things, and particularly the way that it does things internationally, is obviously very different than a democratic regime would in pursuing the same Chinese strategic ambitions internationally. And I think that that is fair game for us to confront and continue to criticize. We should wish that we don't have this kind of regime to deal with. I guess maybe I made the mistake of equating the regime change issue with this focus on the party over the people. It's the regime change as a policy that I think would be counterproductive to stability in China and the relationship.
I agree with that. I don't see any value in saying something like that, and I think we have to be very cautious about doing anything that would suggest that's our aim. But then the question is, well, what are we trying to do? And we can perhaps talk about this, but we want to try to change the thinking and the calculations of the current leadership, and perhaps in the long run to increase the likelihood that a leadership group might emerge that would take a different approach. And in the very long run, I would say we don't want to foreclose or preclude the possibility that in the future there might be some more fundamental change in the character of the regime. That's not for us to accomplish, but it's also something that we can say and have said.
So to add my own spin on this, are you both agreeing that the approach that we ought to take on this is a lot more like what George Kennan prescribed about the Soviet Union back in the 1940s? Recognize that this regime has some internal weaknesses, some serious ones, and allow those weaknesses over time to have their effects, but not necessarily make it a near-term objective to hasten the march of history by making regime change a goal. Is that fair?
I think so. I mean, I've written separately, and I won't go into it. I mean, although Kennan himself thought that containment was not applicable to China, he advocated policies toward it starting in the 1960s that sounded a lot like his description of containment in the X article. But I think the difference now, and I think he would still continue to promote that kind of idea, but I don't think he would rule out the simultaneity of a policy of engagement. And this is a separate debate we could have, but I think engagement is still the best approach to influencing China's regime and shaping its choices, which I think has been, it's been declared a failure by some, but I quipped about this earlier. But I think that what looks like containment, certainly, well, I'll say this, whatever we're doing, the Chinese call it containment, regardless of how we deny it. But whatever it is, we're trying to prevent the expansion of Chinese influence relative to ours in the region and in the world. And I think we should continue to do that. But I don't think we can abandon, nor do I think Kennan would have thought we could or should abandon engagement, because that is also a vehicle for influencing the regime. And it's also a vehicle for pursuing any number of bilateral and multilateral issues that we need to pursue with the Chinese.
Could I just add, I think there's engagement and there's engagement. And there are some aspects of the policies of engagement that we have pursued towards China over the last 40 years, which I think have had the effect not of producing the kinds of changes that we hoped they would, but of reinforcing and enabling the regime to continue to function in the ways that it would prefer to function, rather than having to undertake fundamental change. So it's one thing to say, well, we're going to stand back and let their weaknesses get the better of them. It's another thing to say, well, they've got all these weaknesses, but we're going to do a lot of things that help them get around those weaknesses without making fundamental change. We're going to sell them all the high-end semiconductors they want. So we're going to not do anything when they steal intellectual property from us. I think we have to rethink that economic aspect of engagement in particular, because what we're doing has enabled them to continue and perhaps would enable them to be more successful in the long run without having to liberalize. It may be one of these ironies of history, and maybe, I don't know, maybe this was the intent of the current administration's economic policies. But I think some of the things that we're doing or have done are kind of reinforcing Xi Jinping's impulses to do things which in the long run are going to be very counterproductive for China. In particular, the increased centralization and the reinvigorated role of the party state in guiding technological development and so on. They seem to be kind of pulling back and trying to do more on their own, even as they would like to continue to get stuff from us. And if they can't continue to get everything they need from us, then I think they're going to have real problems because they are not yet in a position where they actually can do the things they want to do without help from us.
Okay, we're rapidly approaching the end of our session, but I'd like to combine a couple of questions that are related and pose them as the last questions to the panel. Dov Zakheim, former Undersecretary of Defense, asks, should the United States be more vocal about what is happening to the Uyghurs? And in particular, should the White House be more vocal about this? And then Chip Gregson asks about China's drive for regional hegemony. Specifically its claim to undisputed historical sovereignty over the South China Sea, its militarization of the sea's artificial features in the Spratlys, their broken pledge over Hong Kong, their abuse of the Uyghurs, their threats to Taiwan. How should we deal with all of this? Thoughts?
I think it's Ali's turn.
I can take a quick question. I can take just a quick crack at this question, and actually wanted to just to draw on some thoughts based on Dr. Heer and Dr. Friedberg's comments. I do think the one challenge that the United States, and I actually think that we should, I realize we're sort of approaching the witching hour, but one of the assets that we haven't talked about as much, I think, in this conversation is how the United States can make use of its just its network of alliances and partnerships. I do think that is, again, and I said at the outset that in confronting various manifestations of Chinese assertiveness that we wish to push back against, whether it's Chinese conduct in its near abroad, whether it's certain Chinese economic practices, certain expressions or manifestations of Chinese ideology, in a purely bilateral contest, I think that the United States is going to find it very difficult to push back against China over the long run. I think that to the extent that it brings on board allies and partners, it has a much better chance not only of forging a sustainable strategy for competing, but also of salvaging, preserving some areas of cooperative space. But in bringing on board allies and partners, I think it'll have to do so selectively, and that is to say, I think that there will be some issues. So I don't think, in other words, I don't think that we should envisage a kind of a grand coalition, sort of a Cold War style coalition of allies and partners to counterbalance China. I think what's more likely is that allies and partners will come on board with us on an issue by issue basis. And I thought that actually a really good example of this, Anya Manuel had an op-ed in the Financial Times just a few days ago in which she talked about how the United States might push back against China or compete with China more aggressively technologically. And she called it she proposes a T10, which would kind of be an analog or sort of building off of the proposal for a D10 coalition of democracies. And she makes the point in there that there are going to be certain areas of technological competition where certain allies and partners might feel comfortable partnering with the United States or even taking the lead. So I think, one point I would make, as we think about how we compete with China, I think that we should expand the aperture sort of beyond a G2 aperture and see what types of assets, military, economic, and diplomatic, our allies and partners can bring to bear, recognizing that they are unlikely to form a grand coalition to counterbalance China. One, because they don't, I think, want to. I think they want to reject the sort of putative choice between Washington and Beijing. And in many cases, just I think particularly for smaller countries in China's sort of just geographic vicinity, they might not have that luxury. So I think that if you talk to Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia, I think that they certainly have very strong apprehensions about what China is doing in the region, but they may not want to decouple from China or be able to decouple from China to the same extent as countries with larger economies might be able to. So I think I would just close by saying, let's think about how we can bring to bear allies and partners in competing with China selectively. I think the more that we are able to expand that tent, the more confidence we will have that we can wage this kind of ambiguous, unspecified competition over the long run with confidence and preserve some space, some cooperative space on these transnational challenges. But again, recognizing that this isn't going to be some cohesive grand coalition on all issues. It's going to be much more a sort of a patchwork of collaboration and cooperation with allies and partners that's specific depending on the issue, depending on perhaps even the region. And so I think that so we should be thinking about not so much assembling a grand coalition, but how do we assemble more dynamic, smaller, issue-specific coalitions over the long haul as we try to think about competitive coexistence and cohabitation with China.
Anyone else thoughts on that question?
Sure. Well, I can address both and then defer to Aaron. I mean, on Dov Zakheim's question, I think absolutely we should continue to put pressure on the Chinese on what they're doing in Xinjiang. I think we've had some success, as have other countries in the UN, in shaming them on this outrageous behavior in the system that they've imposed upon the province. And we need to continue to do that because our values demand it of us. And having said that, though, I don't think we can be optimistic that we have a lot of leverage with which to influence what they're doing there, or that we can. I'm not optimistic that we're going to have great success in altering their behavior there because, especially if even other Muslim countries are ambivalent because of their relationship with Chinese to put pressure on them. I think this is one of those issues where the Chinese, they've certainly inflated what they perceive to be a domestic threat of terrorism. I mean, I think that there is a threat there, but they've gone all out. And as long as internal stability is the core issue, external pressure is going to have a marginal effect, unfortunately, I think, over time. On Chip Gregson's question, it's a great question. It addresses a lot of things. I agree with Ali's point about the need for kind of issue-specific coalitions. I think we can do that on all of this whole range of issues where Chinese have been assertive in the region, Hong Kong, South China Sea, Taiwan, whatever. I think we need to continue to put pressure back on them. One thing I would say, though, is that as I said in my earlier remarks, we should not overly emphasize the military solutions to issues that are not primarily military and don't lend themselves to military solutions. And I think the South China Sea and certainly Hong Kong, it's not a military problem for us, fit into that category. The last point I would make, which is perhaps a little bit of a minority view, is that I think even if we don't agree with them, we need to understand the extent to which the Chinese see their behavior in these areas as reactive to what other players are doing. In the South China Sea, in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, these are not areas where the Chinese are looking for opportunities to escalate tensions in the region. They have a lot of domestic priorities. They're doing what they feel they have to do because of challenges to their security or their sovereignty. And it's accurate for us to say that they're exaggerating the nature of those and the extent of those challenges, but I don't think we're going to be able to address it in a constructive way until at least we can understand where they're coming from when they frame the issues that way.
Aaron, I will give you the last word should you want it.
Okay, well, just very briefly on Dov Zakheim's question, I agree with Paul. This is something to which we should be calling attention. The more we have a coherent and consistent position on issues of human rights as a country or as a government, the greater our credibility when we raise these kinds of issues. It's unfortunate if this might appear to some people to be a sort of last minute change of heart on the part of the current administration because of its deteriorating relationship with China. I agree that it's not likely to produce change, or it seems unlikely to do so. But in this instance, as in others, we should be making the CCP regime pay a price for its behavior. And I would say pay a price for its behavior internally as well as externally, because part of what we need to do to diminish their efforts to extend their own influence part of what we need to do to rally a coalition of like-minded countries to push back against them, again, is to highlight the character of the regime. This is not, this behavior is not an accident. It's not a peculiarity. It's something which is unfortunately not that surprising in a regime like the current CCP regime, and we should be emphasizing that fact. The question about China's drive for regional hegemony regarding South China Sea and Taiwan, this is huge, of course, question. To me, I guess the issue is how can we maintain a favorable balance of power in the kind of Western Pacific, where we continue to have interests and allies and continue to rely on sea lines of communication, favorable to the extent that it deters aggression or attempts at coercion by China? And if so, how are we going to do that as time goes on and as the resources that they devote to this problem themselves continue to grow? It's obviously not easy. Among other things, it's pretty clear that we're going to have to do business differently than we've done it in the past, and probably can't rely on great big aircraft carriers as principal tools of power projection and so on. One thing I would say, though, is I think it was Bismarck who said we shouldn't commit suicide for fear of death. There is a tendency sometimes to look at all this and say, oh my God, we can't possibly stand up to this. I'm not at all convinced of that. People said that about the balance of forces in Central Europe in the 1970s. So we need to put our minds to it, but we need also to cooperate with others in doing it. I guess overall, it's the classic formulation. We need to demonstrate and reinforce the perception that we have the resolve to back up our commitments, including to Taiwan, but we need to make sure that we have the capabilities in order actually to do that. Just saying we're going to do it and we're going to send this government official and that government official without a clear plan and program for strengthening our long-term strategic position in the region is poking a bear with a stick.
All right, well, thank you. On that note, I'm going to draw this discussion to a close. I want to thank all of our panelists. I think you've been an outstanding panel, excellent discussion, and we've had some excellent questions from our audience. I regret that we lack the time to address all of them on this session, but that gives us an opportunity to do another panel where we can get into this in even more depth. So thank you all for your time. We look forward to seeing you at our next event.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thanks so much.
We'll be in touch.